Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone. I've had the honor of kind of kicking this off. I want to give tons of credit to Action on Smoking and Health, Chris Bostic for fueling this. Megan, thanks for the admin technical support. We've got a great panel that's lined up here, and it's all about when will the last cigarette be sold? I think, imagine a world, many of us have been doing this work for a very long time, very passionately. For some of it's personal, and we've been doing this a long time. We're headed in the right direction, certainly with combustible tobacco products. So it's reimagining, creating a moment to think and reimagine what does the world look like without cigarettes. Sometimes the term endgame is used. I've heard Mitch Zeller use the term end state recently, or next state, however you call it. It's taking from the existing, what I would describe nibbling around the edges kind of positions, to truly transformative options, and thinking big about what could be possible. New York has been a leader in this area for decades, tremendous progress, and I think that's why we're here. We can almost smell it, that there's a big win that's right around the corner. And we had a tough go this legislative session, but it's not over. The legislative session is not over. There are other options, other opportunities, and the panel here each will have their own perspective and view on options and ways to go forward. So I'm thrilled to be part of this. I'm thrilled to be part of these big picture discussions, truly transformative options if we can succeed here. And with that opening remark, I'll turn it over to Tony. And mute. Tony.
Thanks, Andy. The one thing I will say that we don't want to smell is secondhand tobacco smoke. So let's hope that that's where we're all heading. We are glad and thankful that ATFC has agreed to support this webinar as a way to give you more information that will hopefully let you consider putting this in your promising practices in year 5 and certainly beyond that. We know that in '64, the smoking rate was at 42% when the first Surgeon General report came out. Today, it's at 11.5%, with New York right there next to the national average. And while it is great success, we keep telling people, especially in our community and our elected leaders, there's still more work to do. And we also especially notice it in this year as we focus specifically on disparate populations of Blacks, Hispanics, LGBTQ+, and many others, where they certainly haven't enjoyed the full advantage. So we're going to hear from speakers today who will explore Endgame. And it's a concept, as Andy stated, that's been around tobacco control for many, many years, but it's taking new life and focus in 2023. The first speaker today is Chris Bostic, and he's ASH's policy director, and he's been working in global tobacco control since 2001, when he attended the negotiations for the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control as a civil society international law expert. Prior to joining ASH, he worked with Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, who we know well, and also the American Lung Association. And he served as a clinical instructor at U of Maryland. And in 2009, he led the efforts of an international coalition to redevelop a civil society shadow reporting program for the FCTC, culminating in a periodic publication of Tobacco Watch. And Chris also holds a jurisprudence from Washington College of Law, Master of Science in Foreign Service, of which he makes great use of traveling the world, bringing the news of Endgame to the far-flung territories that he is very generous in reporting on. So please welcome Chris Bostic from ASH.
Thank you, Tony. That was a very nice introduction. Let me just get my my screen share on here. And let me know if you can see that. Are we good? We're good. I see a thumbs up. Great. Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone. I'm very excited about Endgame taking this step in New York State. As Andy pointed out, New York has always been a leader and on the cutting edge of tobacco control, and I think it will be again on this. So I'm going to start by just laying out the basic argument for why, or at least the argument that we use for why Endgame is a necessity and not just something that we want to do. And it comes from what we call a human rights-based approach to tobacco control, which is something that the Action on Smoking and Health adopted about 15 years ago. And when we looked through the tobacco epidemic through that lens, we came to the inevitable conclusion that Endgame is where we have to go. So let me start with the UN human rights system, and I won't go through all of it. This is just one example. From its very foundation, the right to health was incorporated into the global human rights norms. And there's two things I want to just point out the way that they put this. The first is that we're attainable. And what it means is that just because people have the right to health doesn't mean that governments are responsible for putting an MRI machine in every home. Right, that's unattainable even for the richest countries. And so what governments are supposed to do is progressive realization of the right. They should do what they can to improve the health outcomes of their people. And I point that out because obviously in tobacco control, the only thing we're really lacking to end it is the political will to end it. And that's what we're all about here is building that political will. And as I'll talk about later, we know the public is with us. And then the other one is the beginning of this, that health is a fundamental right, indispensable for the exercise of other human rights. There are a lot of human rights, and they're supposed to be seen as a whole, not separate, and they are supposed to be equal. However, it is a recognition that if we're not alive, we can't realize all of our other human rights. And so this is a foundational part of achieving human rights. So that concept has been pushed forward in tobacco control by the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And I know some people probably heard the story, but I'll be very quick. We found out a few years ago that DIHR had entered into a contract with Philip Morris International, and it was basically a whitewashing attempt for their work on like child labor on tobacco leaf farms. And we reached out to them and said, you can't do that. You're a government entity. And Denmark has signed the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and it's under Article 5.3, that's illegal. And so they put this on their website. They canceled the contract immediately within hours and gave the money back. Then they put this on their website. And it basically says that by doing their daily job, by the tobacco industry just selling and marketing these products, they are violating human rights every day. And that the only way they can live up to international human rights norms is to go out of business immediately. So we've gotten a lot of mileage out of that. This has been widely adopted within the human rights circles worldwide, and has come to be adopted also by the tobacco control community. And this is the Cape Town Declaration on Human Rights and a Tobacco-Free World. This was adopted in 2018 by at the World Conference on Tobacco or Health in South Africa. And right up front is the agreement that just doing their job every day is a violation of human rights. And later in the document, of course, we go into the fact that what that means for governments is that they have a duty to stop them, because we know they're not going to stop themselves. So what are some of the key things here? First, health equity is paramount when you take a human rights-based approach. And as Tony said, we've made some tremendous strides in this country, but we have left people behind. One way to look at it is we have solved the tobacco epidemic for white suburbanites, but other communities have not enjoyed the same increases in their health, and we owe it to them. We owe it to these communities to bring them up. And one of the things about Endgame is that if in any given jurisdiction we can end the sale of these products, it can't help but disproportionately positively affect those groups that have been left behind. Second, that governments have a duty as well as a right to stop the tobacco industry. I'm not going to go into the exact legal arguments for why that's true, but I think this is a kind of a sea change in the way we look at this. We've always felt that the governments were doing a favor to their people by putting tobacco policies in place that would reduce tobacco use, but they have a duty to do so under human rights norms. And human rights norms don't just apply to countries; they apply all the way down to state and local governments. Third is a recognition that the perpetrator of this epidemic is the tobacco industry. I think we have a somewhat shameful history in tobacco control that's going out, but of blaming the victims, of blaming people that are smokers. If we could just get those darn smokers to stop, we could end the tobacco epidemic. But that's not really the case here. We know that tobacco is addictive, and we know that most people start as children, and children cannot make decisions about becoming addicted. So Endgame, therefore, is about the supply, not the demand. Not that we shouldn't be focusing on demand as well. There are a lot of places that are not ready for Endgame because their prevalence is still too high. So we need to ratchet up our demand policies. But for the true Endgame policies are going to be about ending the supply. And of course, people who use tobacco are our clients. They're not our opponents. And we should be seeing them as the biggest single group of people that we can help improve their health, right? There are millions of people who, many of whom will die if they don't quit tobacco, and we owe it to them to help. And that brings us to the last one, which is that cessation support is vital. We can't abandon these folks. One way to look at this is that as a society, we have failed these people by allowing the tobacco industry to prey on them while they were children for decades. And we owe them the support to reverse that. So that brings me to Project Sunset. Project Sunset was started in 2018 by ASH, and it is a global movement to phase out the sale of commercial tobacco products. We've been very lucky to have a wonderful steering committee, which many people on this call are on, to help guide ASH as we have moved this forward. And I'll show you a map later, but when we started, Endgame was virtually non-existent in the world, and slowly we have clawed our way out of that and made at least the concept a norm, and now we have a lot of policies on the ground. So there are two imperatives on Project Sunset, and they relate very closely to some of the things I said about human rights. First, that it targets retail sales, not purchase, possession, or use. And this is really important, and we won't support a jurisdiction that puts in penalties for purchase use, PUP, as we call it sometimes. And as an example, this year there were 2 bills, state-level bills on tobacco-free generation. One in California, which did not include violation penalties for purchase, use, and possession, and one that did. And of course, we supported the former, but with the latter, we worked with them to try to change it. It ended up being defeated. They all ended up being defeated. But we're going to be working with them next year to reintroduce it without those PUP elements. And the second, of course, is access to cessation. There has to be support in place. It has to be rigorous support. And I think we should always be thinking about how we can improve our access to cessation. It is helpful for society. We shouldn't see this as a cost, but an investment. We know that tobacco has a huge negative economic impact on society as a whole. And it benefits everyone to help people who smoke to quit. So a little bit about preemption. One of the things we run into when we talk to especially states is that isn't this going to be federally preempted? And the answer is no. The 2009 Act that gave FDA finally authority over to regulate tobacco products explicitly maintained the right of states to regulate or ban sales. And that is passed along, especially in the case of New York, to local jurisdictions. And so you don't need to worry about preemption. The industry may sue, but they've tried this on flavor bans, and it made the same argument that it was federally preempted. And those are now being tossed out of court regularly because it's been decided. And then the second thing is we can't wait for the FDA, because that same act explicitly told FDA that they can't ban sales. And there's a good reason for that, because if the FDA applied the same rubric to tobacco products that they apply to every other consumer product, they would have no choice under their own rules but to ban tobacco sales. Congress knew that. Congress is largely in the pocket of the tobacco industry, and so they made sure that the FDA won't do that. So we have to do it ourselves. So just a quick update on where we are in the world. When we started Project Sunset in 2018, this map had one pin in it, and it was right over, right there on Bhutan. And you'll notice the pin is gone. In 2006, the king of Bhutan banned tobacco sales to help improve the health of the people. Unfortunately, during COVID, they rescinded that law because they were worried that smuggling of illicit tobacco products would bring COVID in. And so they haven't put it back in force yet. So that pin is actually removed from the map. But all these other pins are now in place. And I won't go through all of them, but let's focus a little bit on the United States. We have We have 6 jurisdictions in place right now that have put endgame, what I consider endgame policies, into effect. First, we have Beverly Hills and Manhattan Beach in California that have completely banned tobacco sales. And that's been in place now, I think, since January of 2021. So we're starting to get some data out of there. The one data point I know we've learned is that no retailers have gone out of business. And of course, that was the main argument, the small business owner would go down. And then in Minnesota, we have 2 cities, Little Canada and Bloomington, that are phasing out tobacco retail licenses. And by that, they mean they'll never give a new license. They will only renew, but that license can never be transferred, which means that as stores go out of business or leave or the owners retire, those licenses will disappear forever. And so eventually they will not have any tobacco sales there. And the same is true for Dolgeville, New York. They did that several years ago as well. And then, of course, everyone knows about Brookline, Massachusetts, implementing tobacco-free generation. No one born this century can ever be sold tobacco, and that means that there are now 23-year-olds in Bloomington that can't buy tobacco in Bloomington. Now, of course, in all of these situations, these communities are bordered by other communities that haven't done it yet. So they're largely symbolic, but we have to start somewhere. And as we know, the country can't do it as a whole. So we're going to have to build our way up, just like we did with smoke-free air. And then the blue pins, the green pins are what we call aspire countries. These are countries who have set very vigorous goals on prevalence and by a certain date. So for instance, Finland has 2% by 2040, and New Zealand was the first to do this with 5% by 2025. You'll notice there's a green pin in the United States. As part of our Healthy People 2030 initiative a few years ago, the United States set a goal of 5% by 2030. But I want to juxtapose something. Over the past few years, both the United States and New Zealand have looked at their progress towards their goals and realized they weren't going to make it with a business as usual approach, that they couldn't just keep squeezing the same policies and hope to get to that prevalence target. To their great credit, when New Zealand realized this, they changed their strategy. And in December, they implemented the world's strongest endgame tobacco laws by far. And they seem to think that they're going to be back on track to reach the 5% by 2025. In juxtaposition, the United States also realized they weren't going to make it, but last year they changed the goalposts and they upped the prevalence target to 6.1%, I believe. So one more reason why we can't really depend on a national law to bring about endgame. We're going to have to do it at the state level. And then I want to just talk a little bit about 2 of the orange pins. And the one is sticking out of Kenya here, Nairobi. That's the home of the United Nations Environmental Program. And they are currently promulgating treaty negotiations to end plastic pollution. And in fact, in about 4 hours, I'm going to be heading to the airport to go to the second negotiating round of those talks. And the idea for tobacco control being there is that we want to get plastic filters banned. And we have the support of the environmental groups right now because they're trying to get rid of single-use, non-essential plastics. And we are the poster child for single-use, non-essential plastics because our plastic is attached to something that kills over 8 million people a year. And so if we can't do that, then why are we having these negotiations? So we're fairly hopeful that we can get a good outcome there. In the meantime, the very discussion is having an effect on national governments. In the last month, Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands, government committees there have all recommended banning filters in their countries. And then the other pin is sticking out of Panama, and that's for the upcoming conference of the parties for the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control that Tony mentioned. And for the first time, this is COP10. For the first time in history, tobacco endgame is on the agenda. Canada put it there. And we're working with them, and we're also working with the government of Panama to do something big around endgame at the COP. This is a big deal. At the time of the negotiations of the FCTC, the idea of banning sales was completely out of everyone's mind. At that point, as an example, this was a 20th century basically policy treaty. At that time, the idea of smoke-free air was so controversial that it barely made it into the treaty. There were even civil society organizations that argued against trying to get it in because we would be seen as too radical. And just to show how things can turn on a dime, at the very last negotiating session, that the article on smoke-free air, Article 8, still wasn't in the text. And the biggest opponent of putting it in the text was the government of Ireland. They led the opposition. We won, and we managed to get a fairly weakly worded article in there, but that was in 2003. In 2004, Ireland was the first country in the world to ban all indoor workplace smoking. So things can turn quickly. Opponents can become allies right away. So some of the opportunities, obviously a lot more opportunities and challenges, but I wanted to focus on these three. First, we've done a lot of polling around the world, in the United States and abroad, and we've discovered that when they are asked about it, the public is way ahead of us on this. As an example, there were two polls in Spain and France last year on the tobacco-free generation concept. 86% of French and 84% of Spanish want to do TFG. That is taking into account, though, that there's a adult prevalence in those countries of 22%. So a significant number of people who smoke also want to do that because no one wants their kids to smoke. And some of you may have noticed just in the past few months that the CDC released some data from a poll they did last year. And when they asked the public if tobacco sales ought to be banned, not even TFG, just banned, 57% said that they would like to do that. The problem, of course, is that that's only when they're asked. Most people are completely unaware that this is even a possibility. And we've found that even decision makers are often unaware that this is possible. Some of the places that have done this, there has been a eureka moment where somebody on a city or county council has thought, wait, why are we just fighting over flavors, or why are we just fighting over hookah? Why aren't we just getting rid of all of it? So we have a job to do there in terms of communications and making people aware that this is possible. We now have several proof of concept examples, which is we didn't have any when we started except for Bhutan. Unfortunately, though, those have received very little national media attention, so it hasn't done a lot to fix that first problem that I mentioned. So we're looking for bigger examples. New York would be one of those. And of course, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, a lot of national and global media outlets are located in New York. So I'm really hopeful that we can get more attention on this issue. And then finally, and this is a huge change from when we started, excuse me, Endgame has been normalized in tobacco policy conversations. It's hard to go to a conference now where Endgame isn't included. And we've actually had to start turning down invitations to speak around the world on this and sort of deputized other people to go and speak because we can't be everywhere at once. But we're even talking about with CDC now of having Endgame be the theme of the next national conference on tobacco or health. And if we can ever get a world conference together again, it will be the theme of that. Unfortunately, though, there are still several national organizations that are not at the Endgame table yet. There's not opposition to Endgame on a city by city or state by state basis. But we need to push to get this to be part of the work plan of some of the juggernauts of tobacco control in this country. And I have no doubt they'll get there. But the sooner they get there, the sooner we can get this stuff off of the market. So this is my last slide. I just wanted to point out that there are resources available. We work with the California Tobacco Control Program, and Tani's going to be speaking in a moment. And we have put together an Endgame hub at the endtobaccocalifornia.ash.org website. There's a lot of materials there. There's more at the ASH site on the Sunset page. And of course, you can feel free to reach out to me. There are a lot of other places that have Endgame, and I'm sorry to exclude some, but I'll just mention three. The Public Health Law Center has a lot of legal information on it, and Project Sunset can in some ways be seen as coming from a series of meetings they held years ago, the Eyes on the Prize. And they've been on the steering committee since the very beginning. And in fact, the retired head of Public Health Law Center is now on the ASH board of directors. There's the Public Health Advocacy Institute at Northeastern University. They are the world's one-stop shop for tobacco-free generation information. And if you recall the lawsuit against Brookline, Massachusetts, it was PHAI that led the successful defense of their policy there. And then there's the Cigarette Butt Pollution Project out of the State University of San Diego, Tom Novotny. They have all the information you could ever need on tobacco product waste. And with that, I think I am done, and I will turn it over back to Tony.
Thanks so much, Chris. We're going to probably revisit that second last slide about opportunities and challenge when we get into a more discussion period. We do have a Q&A box here, and if thoughts occur to you during each presenter, please put their questions in, and we'll work to answer them once we get through the next two speakers. We're excited to have our next speaker, who is a member of the ASH Steering Committee, the Project Sunset, but is kind of on the front lines in America. Tanya Hageman is the chief of the Community and Statewide Intervention Section at the California Tobacco Control Program, our fellow traveler across the United States. And she spent the last 25 years there. She currently supports implementation of over 200 projects engaged in local tobacco policy work, involved in multiple campaigns, including countering tobacco industry sponsorship, engaging local projects to ensure compliance with MSA, transnational tobacco and tobacco in the entertainment industry, stuff we've all had our hands in at various times. So I'd like you to welcome a fellow traveler in our fight for tobacco control, Tanya Hageman.
Thank you. I am really honored to be here. Let me just get my screen up. All right. Okay. I'm really honored to be here talking to you. I'm a big fan of New York's work. We've been following you for many, many years now. Andy's been on our evaluation task force in the past, and I've worked with your state health department. We compare notes, we share info and resources and intel, and we kind of have this coast to coast philosophy where we're trying to get things moving on both ends of the country. So I'm really excited to talk with you all and just share a little bit about where we're at with Endgame, because it's an evolving thing all the time. There's a lot to it. But I'll just dive right in. What we've done a lot in California and spent a lot of time on internally is strategic planning and thinking about what is Endgame? How are we going to define this? How do we build in broad goals, measurable things, and still allow for different places that communities are at? Everybody's starting from a different place. So I won't go into this whole pyramid, but there were many hours of work put into this, and where we got to as sort of our North Star guiding principle is just ending the tobacco industry's influence in California. And that can take a lot of different forms, but that's where all of our efforts are heading.
Tanya, we're not seeing the pyramid, except, well, we're seeing it down the side, but we're still on the first slide, and you're not in the presentation mode, at least from our perspective.
Oh no! All right.
Maybe stop sharing and restart.
Yeah. Okay.
And now are you hitting the presentation mode?
Yes.
Yeah, you go to slideshow and then start from first slide.
It is not wanting to do anything.
Anya, you can also email me your slides and I can share them for you.
All right.
Do you want to do that, and we'll jump to Ken and then come back to you?
Yeah, let me try and do that. I seem to be having some problems with the system.
Well, so sorry, but we've all been part of that, so it's no big deal. All right, let's jump to Ken, and I'm going to go very briefly because you all know Ken, and you see a lot of him. He's one of our own, and why we included him was because of his longevity in tobacco control. Is it more than 25 years now, Ken, or close to it?
Yeah, I started in '97, and then the program, of course, came about in 2000.
And he's been part of nearly every aspect. I'd say maybe all except the quit line, but you probably had a hand in promoting it down in your neighborhood in southern Western New York. But he's here to talk about that New York has had lots of success. It's a case of not just starting from scratch and approaching Endgame and saying, well, now let's start a whole new thing. We're talking about bridging where we've been and what we've done in New York, being as successful as California and a leader in the United States in tobacco control. But how do we go from there and all we've accomplished to 2024 and beyond, as we start to look at just changing the approach, changing the language, whatever we need to do. So here's Ken, and then we'll loop back to Tanya to get back to California. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Tony. As he already mentioned, it was about my introduction to tobacco control kind of came suddenly. I was a newly elected county legislator in 1997, and one of the very first things presented to me was we were looking at passing a countywide clean indoor air bars and restaurant policy. And as it turned out, I was the tie-breaking legislator on that. Basically, they had everything lined up and I was the deciding vote. I came in not knowing anything about tobacco control. I easily was convinced, but I had a lot of doubts that it really was something that was supported by our population. So I came in with a lot of doubts. And as it turned out, due to pressure from tobacco industry folks, including death threats against myself and others, the legislation was withdrawn, and eventually we didn't get those kinds of policies until New York State passed it. But that was my introduction by fire to tobacco. And I joined the coalition at the time that was meeting. And then as New York State developed the comprehensive tobacco control program, got involved in that later on. But what I'm doing is just giving a little bit of an overview from a New York State policy perspective. I won't be talking about local regulations because there are so many different things that have been tried, but just giving a history of where New York State was at, because I recognize that when I started in tobacco control, and several times along the way, a policy or an idea would be proposed and I would say, oh, that'll never fly. That'll never happen. I never believed we'd get clean indoor air in New York State. I just didn't think it would happen. And lo and behold, within 3 years of starting in the program, it happened. And other things came up over time. And I'm recognizing that everything we've done in New York and throughout the country are all steps towards the tobacco endgame, ending commercial tobacco. And if you would have told me that 25 years ago, I would have thought you were a lunatic, that it would, there's no way. But I actually see the excitement of what can happen. So really in New York State, I divided this up about with clean indoor and outdoor policy. And then we'll talk about sales, and we'll talk about taxation, just to show what New York State has done. So really our Clean Indoor Air Act was created in 1989, and it just involved a few places like auditoriums, elevators, food stores, cabs. It was amended to prohibit smoking in workplaces, including bars and restaurants, in 2003. And that was huge. Most of you who have been alive at that time remember the I Love Smoke-Free New York campaigns and all the excitement over that. And then it was later amended to include e-cigarettes and smoking within 15 feet of building doorways at hospitals, residential care facilities, and then finally prohibiting smoking within 100 feet of school school entrances, and then restricting at New York State playgrounds during the day when children are present. There were a lot of qualifications to that, between dusk and dawn when children are present. That was in 2013. And then adding the restriction against vaping in workplaces. Vaping got added to the Clean Indoor Air Act in 2017. And then smoking and vaping prohibited in any facility that provides childcare services in 2018. And that includes home-based childcare even when there are no children in the home. There technically cannot be smoking in that home if they're providing childcare services in that space. And then 2019, no smoking within 100 feet of public or association restaurants, libraries. And you can see the signs that were made across at least across the southern part of New York State. We developed signs that we took to them. And let me see if I can, okay. And then 2021, I just added the marijuana smoking restricted where tobacco and vaping are restricted by New York State law. And 2022 prohibits smoking in all municipal or state operated beaches, pools, boardwalks, marinas, playgrounds, or recreational areas, which was great, but it was a surprise. And we're still working with our municipalities to let them know that this is actually in effect. Many of them are trying to play dumb that they don't know anything about it. So we've got a little work to do there. Moving on, here we go. When you're looking at sales and products, really 1985 was the beginning of tobacco control policy officially in New York State, when prohibited the sales of cigarettes below cost. Then by 1998, I think, that's the best I could do. I researched everywhere as to when the Adolescent Tobacco Use and Prevention Act was enacted. And all I know, it was sometime after 85 and before 2000, but based on doing the math from reports, it looks like it was 1998. And that, helped develop a network of compliance and checking on store sales to minors. 2002, we restricted common carriers from shipping cigarettes to private cigarettes in New York State. And just as a side note, for those that don't know, New York State reality check students played a major role in that happening, in that they did some undercover work for our then Attorney General Eliot Spitzer, and sent a report to Eliot Spitzer, which helped to lead to these restrictions taking place. 2012, point of sale displays restricted in large retailers and supermarkets, then also restricting the sales of e-cigarettes to those under 18. So e-cigarettes got added only in 2012. Then 2013, vaping products restricted from self-service. Self-service sales had been previously restricted, and vaping was added. 2015, child-resistant containers were required of all e-liquids, based unfortunately on a couple of deaths that took place. Young toddlers getting into vaping containers and drinking the liquid. 2019, state license was then finally required for vape sales, and New York State was able to raise the purchase age for tobacco and vapes to 21. Several of our counties had been able to do that previously, but by 2019, it became New York State policy, and then later federal policy. And then 2020, we have a whole slew of sales based restrictions about a lot of it was about vaping, must disclose ingredients. Wholesale distributors were now subject to state regulation. They increased penalties for underage sales. Vaping products were added to the shipping restrictions that were put in place in 2002, prohibiting sales of vaping products that lack the FDA marketing order that dealt with flavors. No price discounting of tobacco and vaping products. So you can see the one little graphic about no tobacco coupons allowed there. No sales of tobacco and vaping products in pharmacies, and prohibiting the display of tobacco and vaping advertisements within 1,500 feet of schools. So a lot happened there. And then even more happened as far as licensing and other issues with some municipalities in New York State. And then we look at the excise tax situation. This was really interesting for me. In 1993, tobacco tax was 56 cents. It was lower than that before it. I couldn't get a lot of historical data, but I know in 93 it was 56 cents. By 2000, it was raised to $1.11. By 2002, to $1.50. 2008, $2.75, and by 2018, $4.35. And of course, now it's being raised to $5.35. And just a reminder that we've been told repeatedly that raising tobacco taxes does lower consumption. So Obviously, this was an important step. And as you can see by the graph, we've had some fairly continuous progress in New York State. And we can continue to do more with that. I took this off New York State's website, just basically to summarize, the fact that the New York State Comprehensive Tobacco Control Program was established officially in 2000, and the strategic actions combined with local and state legislation have led to, and this is kind of a summary of the things that the Tobacco Control Program probably is most proud of: the restrictions on smoking and vaping in most places of employment and other public spaces. One of the highest, now the highest in the nation, highest state tobacco taxes, a tax on vapor products, a ban on the sale of flavored vapor products, an end to the use of tobacco product coupons and discounts, the end of tobacco product sales in pharmacies, strongly enforced laws that restrict minors' access to tobacco, the ATUPA program that I mentioned, and increased retailer penalties for tobacco sales and violations. So basically, that is what I had, and just thought it was a good walkthrough to kind of see where we started from and where we are now. And it's really exciting now to envision where we'll be 2, 3, 5 years from now. Hopefully I'm alive and around long enough to see it. I'd love to see the tobacco endgame in my lifetime, and I think I will. And if I had said that 5 years ago, I would have been probably lying to myself, because I wouldn't have believed it at that point. But I think we're on the right track. So ending commercial tobacco, that we have that promise ahead of us.
Thanks so much, Ken. And maybe it was the right thing to actually have New York go first, because as you saw, we have had great success over several years. And what will be now is Tanya can talk to us about California's success, but also maybe about how their mindset has shifted, looking more currently toward Endgame. So let's see if we can, let's see where we go with that. So off you go, Tanya.
All right, we'll try this again. So if we can go, I think we were on the next slide. There we go. All right, there's the pyramid. Now you see the pyramid for our strategic planning. And we did a lot of thinking about what we wanted to strive for, what our goals should be, how could we be inclusive, what our local projects ready for, because that's really where the action and power is at the local level. So here's sort of our thinking at the state level about where we wanted to get to in ending the tobacco industry influence, and that being sort of our North Star for all of our work. And that's where we wanted to lead to. Next slide. So we came up with several broad goals about how we were going to get to that point on the pyramid. So eliminating the tobacco industry's influence, making all of our communities tobacco free, and ending the tobacco use epidemic. So you can see kind of the columns below are things that we felt fall into each of those categories, where we could kind of break it down, get to those measurable objectives and activities to strive up towards those broad goals. So policy work such as reducing public officials accepting donations, like that's one area to work on to get us to that number one. Looking at reducing product availability, reducing second and third hand smoke exposure, all that work is going to help get us to number two and having all of our communities be tobacco free. Ending the use epidemic, really looking at equity, trying to increase quit attempts, making sure we're not leaving any communities behind. So those are the areas where we're trying to work towards. Next slide. Okay, now this is the best part of the presentation, because locals are where it is at. This is where the hard work gets done. This is where we learn things. This is where there's a ton of experimentation going on. And right now we don't know what's going to be successful, what's going to be the thing that takes off. Like you, we recently had a flavors law passed. a few years ago, that wasn't even on our radar. That happened at the local level. And it really took off. It was something that the people of California and lots of different communities really latched onto as something that was important to them. We don't know what that next thing is going to be for the end game. So we're going to try a whole bunch of different stuff. So next slide. So we started with our local health departments because for our program, we fund local health departments as well as community-based organizations. The health departments tend to be the most stable in terms of funding. They have the most experience. They're sort of the backbone in the community and provide some of that infrastructure. So we started there with a campaign around Endgame to just draw out an initial vision of what that could look like, what people could start working on. So we called it the End Commercial Tobacco Campaign and built it into local work plans starting in 2022. Next slide. And what we decided to do, because communities are all at different places in terms of readiness and being able to conceptualize the end game, how to get there, what's most relevant and important for their individual communities, we identified 2 policy pathways. So we call them our trailblazers, high degree of readiness. They typically have a lot of policy experience. They're ready to just go for it and try and get the highest impact policy the fastest. They typically have good support from policymakers. And we decided to call them trailblazers. They were going to get there the fastest, lead the way. We could learn from their experiences. So we had certain requirements that they had to follow. They were typically going for the harder policies like end the sale. Pathfinders, they're still going to the same place. They're taking a little bit of a different path. They have to do some additional groundbreaking. They have to clear some pathways. They have to work a little bit to get that community support built up, to really help their communities understand the impact, to think about which policy is right to get them going on that road. It might be a more incremental approach to get to the end game, but they're going to make progress as they go. Next slide. And we really just came up with, like, everybody's readiness is different. Every community is different. And that's okay. We're going to start wherever people are, and we're going to move forward from that starting point. So building up community support, talking with elected officials, laying out the vision of Endgame for that community, building capacity, looking at community-specific framing, because even the same policy may have different framing in a different community and reasons why that policy is right for that community. So thinking about those questions was really important. Next slide. So some examples of the Trailblazer and Pathfinder pathways. So for our Trailblazers, we asked them to take a very comprehensive look. So if they were going to go after a secondhand smoke and really work on that tobacco-free community, we wanted them to address smoke-free multi-unit housing, comprehensive smoke-free outdoor public places, really taking the whole secondhand smoke issue broadly and comprehensively across the whole community. We also identified eliminating tobacco product sales with an environmental slant. So tobacco product waste is a strategy point that seems to really resonate with some of our communities here in California. Surprisingly, not only what you might traditionally consider to be a progressive, environmentally proactive community, also with many of our rural communities and our tribal communities, because that message really resonates with who they see themselves as being pro-nature, pro-environment, protecting that resource and protecting tourism in those areas. So that particular slant has an interesting, that's kind of that different framing depending on the community. So looking at that particular policy, there's a couple of different angles of approaching that policy. Another trailblazer was no sale at all of commercial tobacco products. not necessarily addressing it from the tobacco waste perspective. For our pathfinders that were trying to take a more incremental approach and needed to do a little bit more work to move down those pathways, we asked for a dual approach with policy. So we asked them to select one community in their jurisdiction and look at a smoke-free issue and a retail issue, because we wanted them, rather than just going after kind of one of those traditional policy areas, to start being able to talk about both and talking about what that meant in the community. That helps facilitate that end game messaging, makes people be able to talk about end game as a thing and move that forward. So multi-unit housing and a retail issue, outdoor public places and a retail issue. We have a lot of communities that have tobacco retail licenses in place at the local level as well as the state level. If we don't have that in place in a community, then taking a very comprehensive approach to a tobacco retail license policy and filling in all of the plugins that you can use within that policy. We also gave communities the option to have an MOU. So if they already have a policy in place in one of these areas, they could partner to fulfill a pathfinder option above. So if there's one policy in place, they could fill in the gap for that second half. Next slide. We had a few required activities for everyone, no matter what pathway they were taking, where they were starting from. We felt these key activities were important no matter what. So thinking about building that broad coalition, bringing in partners that may not necessarily be traditional, but who will help build the effort, linking with those kinds of other community organizations. Creating a speakers bureau to be able to articulate Endgame, talk about Endgame, help people understand what it is and why it's important. Conducting that educational outreach, speaking with key community influencers, key community groups, policymakers, collaborating with enforcement agencies. So having those discussions about policy implementation, policy enforcement before policies are in place. Getting enforcement agencies on board early is really important to the success long-term. We also wanted people to think about helping small businesses transition away from tobacco sales, because if we were talking about ending the sale of tobacco, that's going to be a thing. Now, that doesn't mean providing incentives, that doesn't mean financial support for those businesses from tobacco money. That means working with small business agencies in those communities to help provide that support to transition to other products. So really defining what that looks like. This is a challenging activity. This is a new partner having to work with business groups or business support groups. Some people haven't done that before. And so there's a lot of kind of navigation and figuring that out and what's going to work in this community versus this community. And we've got some really interesting things starting to percolate that are really going to help us spread that and lift up that strategy. Earned media and paid media. Important for softening the ground with any kind of effort, really letting the public know about tobacco issues in the community, inspiring them to think about doing something about them. So softening that ground. And then having an implementation plan. So getting a policy passed is only the first step, and then really thinking about how to implement it well is key. So thinking about that early on, who needs to be involved, how's that going to happen, what are the messages that need to go out, all of that sort of thing. Next slide. And then, of course, evaluation. So for all of the policy work, we're asking each of our projects that is working on this endgame to take a look at those communities. They're looking at observational data about secondhand smoke and tobacco waste. They're also doing key informant interviews, public intercept surveys. We're looking at tobacco retailer density. Is that changing? We're looking at community engagement. How are we doing with that? What else could we do? So lots of different evaluation measures to help us navigate and figure out what's making certain areas successful, and how can we build upon that? Next slide. And finally, I'll just say a little bit about centering the endgame and health equity. Chris noted this is really important. One of the things that we think about with our endgame advisory committee is we don't want to leave communities behind. We don't want tobacco to be out of some communities and still in others. So next slide. The CDC recommends several approaches, so we've tried to build those into the campaign. Partnerships with populations, connecting to other priority issues, avoiding inequities and unintended consequences, and then of course the monitoring and evaluation. So you can see how some of those required activities do build on these recommended approaches. Next slide. And we did have some specific health equity requirements that we're working with communities on. So authentic engagement with diverse communities, thinking about engaging diverse communities in the policy leadership roles and really having good representation at the table and engaged fully in the policy process, building community capacity, providing culturally and linguistically appropriate media support, building health equity into laws and enforcement. So what's appropriate for one community in terms of an enforcement agency may not be appropriate for another community. So really thinking about that, working with policymakers to navigate that is important. And then building a diverse public health workforce pipeline. So that's something we're really committed to. We actually have a required activity in all of our local projects that they have to have intern placements that are paid, and they're expected to bring in new public health workforce workers, teach them what public health is like, encourage them to pursue that as a career, give them nice meaty projects to get them excited, and build that public health workforce pipeline. And that's something that has been really successful for us at the state level. We've had a number of MPH interns. I've been delighted to hire many of them into the state public health workforce, and they are some of our rising stars in tobacco control at the public health department here in California. Next step. Okay, and partnerships. So we do have some requirements in terms of equity and tobacco-related disparities that are built into our latest tobacco tax. So we're really paying attention to that. We're working with communities to make sure that we're getting that broad support. We're engaging diverse sectors that we might not have before in terms of small business groups, environmental groups, lots of different kinds of organizations that can latch on to Endgame and be a part of it. And that's really driving a lot of the work. We have those health equity requirements for all of our funded health departments and local programs. Next step. And of course, we couldn't do it without our technical assistance providers. So we're really fortunate in California, we were able to build a part of our infrastructure is technical assistance support that's provided by Public Health Law Center. We have a project out of UCSF, Ruth Malone, that's the Upend Tobacco Project. That's really strategic planning specifically around Endgame and helping us navigate how do we get to those policies that we really want to strive for. Community organizing is run by the American Heart Association in California, and they're really helping us with the community organizing aspect, teaching people how to do that at the local level. ASH is helping us with communication around Endgame, some of those talking points you saw, and helping us navigate where are we in terms of the international scene, how can we fit into that, and what can we contribute. And then finally, of course, evaluation. So UC Davis has our Tobacco Control Evaluation Center, and they really are helping us with all of those data collection requirements in terms of how to navigate that, providing survey instruments and tools that can be used at the local level, and helping us to wrap up some of that data to help us share our findings about what's going on. Next slide. And finally, I'll leave you with this really exciting piece of information that we're also seeing here. So communities are really interested in this idea. They're energized. They want to do this work. In addition to Beverly Hills and Manhattan Beach, who have been early leaders, we have 18 communities with policies in progress that are endgame policies, and they're working on trying to get those through the system and in place, and doing all of those extra activities to build support and get the word out that this is something that we can do. Chris noted, like, there is support for it. There's just not a lot of information out there that this is a possibility. So that's something we have to work on, is really sharing that, yes, this can happen and we can help make it happen. Next slide. We do our own polling here, of course, and we've got really good polling that supports endgame policies. So when we start looking at specific policy ideas, very strong support about outdoor dining, 80% support that. All public places should be made illegal. If you look at that, we've got over half. Pharmacies, a gradual ban on the sale of cigarettes, 53%. There should be an immediate ban. Not as good, but still more than one would have thought. Next slide. And this was the vice mayor of Beverly Hills, and I always like to share this quote because he was so impactful in getting that policy passed. And he just noted, we wouldn't let stores sell edible rat poison for human beings. If we truly want to lead, we need to have the courage of our convictions. And I would just say that that's a great motto for all of us to follow. We need to have the courage of our convictions and move forward on endgame and supporting communities to do that. Next slide. All right, that's it for me.
Tanya, thank you very much. I'm not sure whether we're looking at a recipe book or an all-you-can-eat buffet with all that you shared. And one of the questions in the Q&A is whether these decks will be shared. And I'm sure we'll be able to get those out. Ken already sent his over and Chris has his. But what we would like to do, and the way this webinar is set up, is for those of you watching on the ATFC side can enter questions into the Q&A, and we'll have a bit of a discussion. And what we'd like to hear is not only your questions about what you heard today from obviously looking forward from Chris and Tanya, but what questions might you have about how you could bring this back to your catchment areas in New York. What we saw in Tanya's deck and a couple slides in Chris's deck was a bunch of suggestions and a bunch of means, but what I also saw was a lot of things we're already doing. We're experts, and much of New York State looks to advancing tobacco-free communities as the gold standard in community relations toward policy change. So what I'm hearing maybe is that we are needing to just move the needle and move the focus. This whole effort that Tanya talked about of mandating health equity has been the forefront of our It's Not Just campaign. And also the new energy from Dr. Lee as our director, who has made it very clear that she's very interested in all sorts of collaborations. And I'm sure she has been in touch with Tanya's folks as Sarah's been out there and talking to them. But this whole idea of collaborating, and we did the same thing when we built the ad campaign by engaging the, and I'm forgetting the exact name, maybe you could help, the Black Health Equity Coalition, Ken?
Yeah, Center for Black Health and Equity. Yeah.
That we relied on them to make sure that we weren't just giving lip service in the language of the campaign. And that's essential, that communities will know if we're just wallpapering this over, or if we're true community citizens and bringing, and the other thing I saw was that Tanya turned it to the communities to say, what is your tolerance level? Where do you want to start? And how can we assist you? So what are your questions? What are your thoughts or suggestions? And if the other question we had was one for Dr. Hyland about cannabis. And someone asked that it's impacted tobacco-free policies on the ground. Some state legislators were opposed to the ban on flavored tobaccos because it did not include marijuana product sales. Do you find cannabis legislation in New York State to continue being a stumbling block? And do you think New York State will start merging tobacco and cannabis use policies at some point? And that's for you, Andy.
It's a great question. Huh? You got an easy one to start off. I mean, I'm trying to channel the state's position. The tobacco control program is a tobacco control program. It's not a cannabis control program. There are certainly opportunities for synergy. I mean, if I were to, and our group has talked with the Office of Cannabis Management in New York about opportunities to replicate, to do something similar to what we have for tobacco control program. A lot of the data collection, the evaluation, the identifying the needs, all that infrastructure that could be added at a marginal cost. The model of having community stakeholders, AFTC, Health Systems Change, media, they might come in different blending, different combinations, but that's a winning formula. And it brings to that, there is revenue that's generated from the sale of cannabis products. It's not exactly clear how that revenue is going to be distributed. The emphasis on health equity is far stronger in the cannabis space, not to diminish the strong health equity focus in tobacco, but it was really at the root of the policy to begin with. So it's a great question. I don't have a definitive answer. There is clearly a path for a lot of synergy, though, to at least have collaborating centers. Right now, the Office of Cannabis Management is not focused on the kinds of things that we're doing here in the tobacco control program. It's more about administrative process, I think, and maybe as that office gets a little bit more time under their belt, then I think there are opportunities. But meanwhile, I think it is very important to say boots on the ground. When we go talk with people, what we're hearing is, yeah, tobacco, but what our issues, on the cannabis side and how they can relate to each other, how policies on one could impact the other. I think that's very important to get that information back to the program so then they can carry that message, beyond to where the policymakers can see what the best approach is from there.
Thanks, Andy. We didn't get any new questions, but I'm going to ask of those of you on this call, if you could use the Q&A box to just enter in whether you could see yourself doing some work specifically toward Endgame. What Van said, and Van's away today, or he would have been joining us, and in an earlier call when Chris joined us, was that you have room in your work plan in year 5 under promising practices to specifically bring Endgame into your work. So if anybody on the call sees that they could see themselves doing Endgame, just type a yes. It would be good to see how many on the call. Another question from Jeannie was whether surveys have been done about TFG, and I would also imagine Endgame. As you saw from Tanya's deck, they did do surveying in California. Chris, could you answer about any other metrics around Endgame and TFG that you're aware of in the United States?
There haven't been as many questions specifically on TFG, but I did recently meet with CDC, and they are interested in expanding the questions they have on tobacco Endgame in next year's survey. And of course, TFG is one of the things that we're strongly considering. But I'm going to push that because I know that, for the pathfinders, TFG is an easier way to go than some of the other Endgame measures, I think. So we need to have that on the table and know what the public thinks about it.
Heather's asking whether some of the endgame approaches can fall under our retail environment objective. I would say a qualified yes. There is, and that's the thing. That's the point we're making, is that this isn't brand new stuff out of the box. It's more of it is about language and mindset change. So I think you could maybe already, as you notice, a lot of Tanya's work was around tobacco-free outdoors and tobacco-free indoors, or multi-unit housing as well. So I think, and the other piece about connecting with outside groups, we've been working with Dr. Novotny in California, who's a colleague of Andy's, on the whole cigarette butt waste, and looking at it here in Erie and Niagara through Jenna Brinkworth. That's a whole nother area to start to use as just an attention caller. A lot of people say, well, ban cigarettes, huh? Really, that's pretty audacious. Or ban filters, that's a crazy idea. It's not going to be so crazy. It's already Senator, her name just flew out of my head, in New York City. She already has a bill waiting for single-use plastics, specifically focused on tobacco filters. And we're talking with her. And Chris has been talking with Dr. Lee about the plastics piece. We're adding, Chris is leaving for Europe to add cigarette butts to an international plastics treaty. It's not going to be so out of the box for so long. That's where it's heading.
Hey, Tony, on the retail piece, a lot of this is luck. There's a lot of, but it's strategic luck, being in the right spot at the right time. And there's a lot of municipalities across New York State, the different shapes, sizes, issues. Many of them are local individuals. They have certain motivations, certain stories. Somewhere, I have a hunch that there's a community, probably a small community, where a town supervisor or an influential board member would be like, we never thought of that. That's a great idea. What do they do in Beverly Hills? We only have 4 retailers on one strip, and exactly what the comment that was made before. Why are we talking about all this nibbling around the edges? Why don't we just ban take a big step? And in fact, I heard that. I gave testimony at a state Senate committee when the vaping flavors were being discussed. And that comment was made 3 times by New York elected officials. If it were up to me, I would ban the stuff, quote unquote. And so somewhere out there's an opportunity. It's just a matter of stumbling across it in the right circumstance, the right people, and having the right information to say, hey, we can do this. Chris has already identified this is feasible. This is not against the law. It's not breaking one of the 10 commandments. In fact, this can very much be done, and some communities have already paved the way. But it is the boots on the ground and the relationships to make it possible. And then once one place does it, then that will be so important for the next place and the next place after that.
Thanks, Andy. We got a couple questions. This one's for Tanya around smoke-free multi-unit housing. She's wondering, these aren't just voluntary policies, but actual legislation that has been done. We've been exploring this as well. And as you all know, HUD policy came out a few years ago that bans smoking in all their developments. So do you want to answer that, Tanya?
Sure, yeah. In California, nothing happens at the state level without a really significant amount of local policy work. So at the state level for multi-unit housing, we have a law that says that locals can do it. That's about it. So we have locals working on multi-unit housing and legislated policies at the local level. Yes.
Thank you. And here's an anecdote from Heather about Dogeville. And this goes to your point about luck and right place, right time, that there was a personal need or want from the village mayor, a vape shop wanting to open up across the street from her home. that along with hearing from youth from her community, our RC youth, bless them, was the motivation that she needed. And it's the case, we've all been through this of, well, if it's not this year, just wait till the next election. And we'll find some amenable people that are here today and are not here today, but maybe here tomorrow. So if no one else, and here's so Jeannie is just sort of adding to the conversation, saying in our area, municipalities that have passed retail environment laws are more progressive, wealthier communities. There are communities that would most likely adopt endgame policies, these are the communities that would most likely go toward that. I would say yes, and again, I think again from Tanya's approach and my sitting on the ASH committee in place of Andy, I brought our custom approach, pay attention to your neighborhood approach, to the conversations that we have in our steering committee meetings, in that we can't be sitting up in the ivory tower of tobacco research. Sorry, Andy. We have to be on the ground paying attention to what these people are telling us. And we know, and I often tell people that if you don't know New York State and you're looking at a red-blue map, you're gonna think New York is a red state. And I respect the ruralness of New York State as we work with Ken and John and Julie and Brittany, who are in 6 very red communities. So to your point, Jeannie, I agree. We're not going to barnstorm in about Endgame. There's electeds that don't want any talk about government interference, et cetera, et cetera. But there are ways, and those 4 people I just mentioned are doing it by approaching their neighbors and approaching their neighbors who happen to be on drug-free committees or on hospital health committees or on county health boards. And they're looking at it from these directions of health prevention, which was kind of the common conversation, but this new approach that we've been in for the last few years, which is around diversity and health equity. And maybe these counties aren't as diverse as the wealthier, more urban leaning communities, but there's ways to have that conversation as well. And I know everyone on this call knows that it's not the easiest thing, but we've always seemed to have found a way, given all the success that Ken reported on. We're kind of coming to the end. I would just maybe ask those of us on the call, Chris, Tanya, Andy, and Ken, if you have a sentence that you want to leave us with. And the promise is we're going to send the recording of this out. We're going to send the slide decks out, and we'll be open to more conversations if you need to with anybody on the call. Everybody on the call is available if you wish. Their contact info will be in the email as well. So give us a nice ending for everybody. Chris?
Sure. It's very simple. We all know that this is going to happen. Why not? Why would we wait?
Thanks. Tanya?
I'm just going to second what Tony said. Listen to the community, because there is an angle for these policies if you're listening to what's important at the community level. We've been really surprised. California is the same. Off the coast, it's a red state. But there's a lot of work that's being done in very rural areas and very policy averse areas because of the desire to protect their kids and also to protect their pure natural living space. So those are 2 angles that we've seen to be really successful. And I think that there's a lot more if we're talking to people and trying to find the right messaging for that specific community.
Thanks. Ken?
I would say just persevere and continue to believe that we will see the end of commercial tobacco in our communities soon.
Andy?
I'm going to quote the great philosopher Gandalf from Lord of the Rings fame. I found it's the small everyday deed of ordinary folks that keep the darkness at bay. And so it's the individuals, those individual relationships, boots on the ground, and together, this incremental progress turns into amazing progress at the end.
Yeah, and I'll just close with to all you on the call. We often say it to each other. it's such an incredible group of people that are so dedicated. I've been around 15 years in ATFC, and it's really us on the ground that are carrying the weight, and you carry it well. And we've done some great things, and I hope that this conversation this morning will be the beginning of more great things together. So thanks everyone for joining us, and look for a follow-up, and we're here if you need us. Cheers. And thanks to Ash for putting the whole webinar together.
Mhm.